what do you picture the prescription and the public awareness of the issues that you just laid out? And the reason I ask is, not to steal any thunder from my talk later, while you look at technology, and I'm inferring possibly policy prescriptions as a solution here, Eric and I are some of the evil people creating this technology, and I say that we're among the leaders in the country and everything you're talking about. And we typically build this because there's a large market of people who want this, and I don't want to pejoratively call them sheeple, but other people I know do. And if the people around you want the services, and we need to deliver and capture and transmit this data to service providers to provide you that service, so we all get paid and the customers are happy, the people have a culpability here as well. By the way, I'm not defending the big evil corporations. I'm just saying that's a calculus. So how would you respond?
Well, firstly, I love your honesty, Pat, and your colleague, because that's what I think CISPO is very renowned for here, this openness and this sharing. And my response will be equally open. And I love this about our workshops. Every year we run them and we have this kind of openness, right? So we will never find a solution if we don't talk openly. So the first thing I would ask, or let's reflect for a second. Is it, let's go really personal for a moment. Someone has kidnapped my child. And I want my kid back, right? Am I going to say, hang on a second, don't use the data that we have available? Because it's unethical to do that. Because all I want is my kid. And all I want is the perpetrator to be caught. And if I have a breadcrumb of the car, if I have a breadcrumb of the Apple iPhone, if I have a location fix at downtown DC, at the corner of, I Street and whatever else, give it to me. Give it to law enforcement, okay? Probable cause actually works at that time. What I'm hoping we don't get into is playing the at-risk game. We're a whole society of people. There are a few really bad eggs among us. Like anyone is really good, right? There are a few bad eggs. And we should weed those bad eggs out because, if we can stop them right at the beginning of their criminal intent, that means they won't commit another crime and another offense, and then, we don't have to put them in jail, and then their costs can be saved. And isn't that a great idea if we can develop Palantir software to start micro-targeting and micro-analyzing, and give me your telephone records, give me every telephone record, and I want every search that you've ever conducted on your Google search engine, and I want every transaction you've ever done on the credit history, and I know I could find it down the road if I wanted to, by the way, and I want every interaction you've ever had on social media, and I want every picture you've ever taken, because I can take the coordinates of the images and the video, and I can do something really, really amazing with them. I can train data. I can train data based on your profile. And your profile doesn't add up. Your education back in elementary school, you flunked a lot. I don't know. Indicators tell me kids who don't pass, they get messed up with online communities. They're offenders. What I don't want is to stereotype society at risk, to eradicate the bad elements, because that's the best way to do it. It's quantitative and based on people's behavior. The just-in-time mentality may work for supply chains. I don't think it works for human beings. But I don't want a society that's chaotic. And somewhere we've got to find a balance, which is not Uberveillance. I don't want us to have a society in maybe 30 years' time where people go, you know what? We're not going to have any more breaches in security because everyone's got chip implants. And, when I used to put the smartphone in my husband's boot and work thought I was actually going to work, but I was staying home, that'll go away in the future, because we're all going to have implants. We're all going to have security devices. We're all going to have the ability to transact with our banks and credits. We can shake hands and give information to one another that way. So I'm hopeful that we don't fall into a pit that says everything that's on, internet enabled, becomes a watching device. because that will change people's physical behavior. That will create a stream of psychological impact that we've never seen before. That's going to create very nervous people. And I'm concerned that we've overstepped the mark. And in terms of citizens' awareness, it's growing rapidly. Rapidly. Cambridge Analytica was the first of many. You know, whoever thought maybe Facebook won't exist? Google's stability, is it really stable? How many more of these breaches can we sustain before we lose trust in organizations? So I think as the awareness is growing, the penalties are rising, and the response has to be commensurate to that cry that's starting to take force. And it's no longer going to be a battle between government and industry. Citizens are going to say, that's my data, I want to blockchain it, I want it to reside somewhere, but I want to be able to consent to when I give it away. Whether you call that a consumer data right or whatever you call it, it's going to be there. It has to be there. Can you reply to that? Because I want to know your opinion.
Well, I agree with the endpoint. My doctoral work was in electronic privacy, and I walked away from it because it seemed that I was fighting a tide because I wanted what you want. So I agree with where you want to go. I'm stuck on the gory interactions, is that your word, of how we get there. But I agree with where you want us to get there. It's a complicated picture.
Yes, and here to say that most of the intrinsic controls we've tried to create through industry guidelines, I studied them for 7 years in Australia, nobody ever adheres to them, they're just guidelines. And other kinds of legal controls that we've put forward in the States, like the Location Privacy Protection Bill back in 2011, and the separate two senators, the GPS bill, which was there to protect privacy, never went up. So legal controls are not working. Soft regulation standards might work. Enforceable things might work. Technical implementations in devices might work. Encryption will work, but not when government is asking us to bust open the encryption and share it with them just in case. So we can get there. I agree with you. I'm optimistic about it, but I'm not optimistic about the picture I've painted today. We're really in trouble. Amy.
I'm trying to formulate this as a question. I'm curious about a sort of a more nuanced side effect of what you're describing, which is the accidental or possibly useful creation of norms of behavior, both individually and sort of in the aggregate. So I start to have information about how sweaty everyone's palms are, and then I get anxious because my palms fall outside of the range of that norm, and everything that you're describing sort of produces more and more of that aggregate sort of individual knowledge about more and more of like my movements, even my own daily habits. So I have anxieties about the kind of delights of anomalous behavior and our recognizing that we can choose it, that we could choose a book that Amazon didn't recommend, or that we can go someplace in a different direction. And so I just wonder whether there is a place to name this, if it's a real thing, and how we learn about that, because it is not a danger or a safeguard in the same way that you've been talking about it, but it, for me, permeated your talk.
So that's a great question, and I'll respond to that with a little story. I'm an ambassador for a company in Australia called Bugbean, and Bugbean created software called Antisocial, there to help young people with perceived addiction to minimize or control and regulate their behavior. Initially, when I signed up for this, I made the organization create a 4-page privacy statement. Because what I anticipated is if this app took off, we would know how often you unlocked your phone. We would know how often you downloaded an app. We would know how often you used Facebook and for how long. Amazingly, the product debuted and had like 11,000 downloads in the first month. It then skyrocketed and became the #1 download in the UK. It wasn't up at the top of the charts for a long time, but now there's hundreds of thousands of people on this application. And I'm cognizant that I'm one of the participants that is giving over my data. When I knocked on the door of the chief executive, a wonderful man who was motivated to create the program to help a neighbor whose son had been heavily addicted at 15. Honorable reasons. He created a privacy contract with me. Yes, we will never abuse this data. We will never sell this data. We will never hand it over. It is now going to be possibly used by law enforcement or military personnel for defense, not to track, to identify at-risk soldiers of suicide, to identify at-risk children. Is that bad or is that good? And interestingly, now to go to your exceptional comment on profiling, and what if I'm an outlier? What does it say? Do I bury my head and go away and cry that I'm not normal? And when I ran one of my studies in my classes of 45 students, you know, the students were gloating. I've got 10,000 waypoints. I said, you had a busy weekend. Yep, I went windsurfing. I went here. I ran on the beach 5 kilometers. And one of my best students comes to me and says, I'm going to fail this assignment. And I said, why? He said, I only have 400 waypoints. And I said, that means you actually worked. And he said, no, but everyone else is doing great things and they're having fun. And I honestly felt like crying because he had determined his level of sociability based on the number of waypoints. And many of us determine our health by the number of Fitbit steps we've walked that day. This is not correct. We can't quantify ourselves like this. The outliers, we know, are heavily addicted, use their smartphone for something like 12 hours straight. You can see them in the reports. 12 hours straight. Now, can we be sure it was the same person? No, because mobile phones can be transferred. For example, I could give my mobile phone to my son, and then to my daughter, and then so on, a friend. But when the outliers are showing 12 hours as opposed to 2.5 hours on average, to 3.5 hours. And by the way, these are people who recognize, you know, most of the people who are suffering with internet addiction or internet gaming addiction don't recognize they're addicted. The first thing they'll say is, I'm not addicted. So the people who have downloaded our app are the people who recognize behavioral patterns in themselves. So I think outliers and exceptions is what you're talking about. They tell us a lot. My worry is that we'll use those outliers to say, you know what, that person probably is mentally ill. They stay home between 9 and 7, or they sleep all day, they don't move. Or other patterns, that kid's autistic. Other patterns are, you know, someone who's impulsive, keep moving. Maybe they've suffered a significant grief and death in their family, and they just need to keep moving and moving. I've met some of these people. So we're going to start making inferences. My problem is these inferences will not always be right. And it's none of our business whether they are right or not right, because we will lose our freedom if we allow technology to dictate. Because if we get up in the morning, Alexa, this, where should I go? What should I do? What's the fastest animal on earth? What's it going to be outside? How about we go outside and feel the snow and go, it's snowing? You know?
I actually hate to interrupt this because it is profoundly important, but we have schedules to keep. Yes, we must move on, sadly. It's 10:10, almost 10:10. So just a couple final points. You made clear that one of the ways we're going to have to intervene here is through the regulatory state and legal frameworks and constitutions and so on. Something you didn't mention, but I know that you also think is important, that's central to the sorts of things we've talked about here over the years is thinking about innovation processes in different ways too, and thinking about how you build in at the early stages of innovation processes a capacity for reflection that keeps us from continually getting blindsided by the stuff that we do when we wake up and say, oh my God, what happened? I should also say, not that you need to hear this, but the potential for a kind of conformity that comes through this is extraordinarily frightening for somebody who I know I would have been drugged into compliance as a second grader with and diagnosed as ADHD if I had been born 30 years later. And now, Lord knows what they would do to my brain. So, so I think this is something that is incredible. When we know that societies are entirely dependent for their creativity on the fringes. Things like unions and unemployment insurance were considered to be completely deviant ideas in the 1890s. Well, now we can take care of those ideas, right, by identifying anyone who would think of them and make sure that they don't have a chance to be hurt. So citizenry and responsible innovation and legal frameworks are what we have. The question is how to mobilize them. So thanks for doing that. And thank you all for participating in the conversation. And I apologize for the soapbox at the end, but I couldn't help myself. We have another event tomorrow. Actually, the speaker at that event, Bob Cook-Deegan, talking about Alzheimer's research and where we might need to be headed to make some progress there. If you can wade through what will be nice weather tomorrow. Hopefully you can to join us again. Otherwise, thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Katina, for an incredibly, I'm not going to say provocative because it is you're putting our noses in where we are and what we have to look at. So, so thank you all. Let the conversation continue. Feel free to hang around and see you all soon.
And you're all welcome to stay for the whole day's proceedings. Now we're going to have a break. And speed networking, please, as we grab some goodies at the back. And I think we have our first talk at 10:30 by Pat Scannell. Thank you.